Well, Fisker Mahula Dunyas Falcha. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Justice Subcommittee on Policing. It's our 10th meeting of 2019, and we have apologies from Jenny Gilruth, who has another piece of parliamentary business she has to deal with. Now, the first item on the agenda is a decision on whether to take item 3 in private, and that's consideration of the evidence we hear today. Are we all agreed on that?
Agreed.
Thank you very much indeed. Item 2 is facial recognition, how policing in Scotland makes use of the technology. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper, and I welcome the witnesses to today's meeting and thank them for their written contributions. So, Dr. Christopher Lawless, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Durham University, Dr. Joe Purhouse, lecturer in criminal law, School of Law at the University of East Anglia, and Dr. Anna Bobak, postdoctoral research fellow in psychology at the University of Stirling. You're all very welcome, and as I say, thank you for your contributions. I'd like to kick off the questions, if I may, and it's about the legal framework. Can the panel outline or comment on the legal frameworks, if indeed there is one, that forms the basis of how this technology is used by police forces elsewhere in the UK, please?
I'd be happy to take that one. So, recently, this has been a topic that's been considered by the High Court in England and Wales in the case of Bridges versus Chief Constable of South Wales Police. Sorry.
Could I just interrupt to say that it's appropriate that we do talk about that. Indeed, I was going to ask about that, but people will be aware that there is the potential for an appeal, so there aspects may be sub judice, but I'm sure you'll be alert to that. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's essentially two issues to consider when looking at whether or not there's a legal framework in place and whether that framework is adequately prescribed to regulate the use of facial recognition technology. I think the first thing to consider is whether or not there's an enabling power to use this technology. And, well, the Home Office and the police forces that have trialled this technology tend to suggest that the enabling power is in the common law. In cases such as Rice v Connolly, it's basically a general power of the police to prevent and detect crime, and that gives the basis for using this technology. Now, whether or not that actually does provide a sufficient legal basis or power to use the technology is something that might be questioned. The common law decisions that created that power were quite general in their terms and were decided at times when this technology wasn't really developed. And in English law, there's generally a distinction that's drawn between physical intrusions, such as assaults or searches that police officers might have to do, or what otherwise would be an assault, but for a legal basis, and informational intrusions. And the way this has been justified in England and Wales, the existence of the power, is that informational intrusions just require a general common law power, whereas physical intrusions require a statutory power. Now, the controversy with that, and I think it will get more controversial into the future, is that as surveillance technologies advance, they enable the police and other public bodies to do more and more intrusive things without actually physically interfering with an individual. So it's questionable whether such a broad general power can adequately permit the police to use the technology. Briefly, the second point is about the existence of a legal basis that's precise enough to regulate the discretion of a public authority to use the technology. Now, what the police that have trialled this technology tend to rely on are a broad range of sort of subsidiary or implicit powers. So data protection legislation to some extent regulates the use of facial recognition technology, as does human rights provisions, as does the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. The question is whether they confer too much discretion to the police to decide the exact parameters of what it constitutes an acceptable or unacceptable use of the technology. And I'm sure that's something we could go into.
There will be a lot more questions. Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Lawless.
I'm just thinking we have in England and Wales there is the Protection of Freedoms Act, but that only covers certain forms of biometric data, DNA, fingerprints and footprints, if I recall. It concerns me that there really hasn't been any more sort of clear or direct pieces of legislation around facial data. I'm aware that of the concerns around perhaps some of the police's approaches to collecting facial data in England and Wales, where there appears to be a system where, or not much of a system whereby images are collected, and there's been a fairly unregulated approach, really. So this is something which really just concerns me. It does lead me to wonder whether the Protection of Freedom Act could be made more clear on facial data, and whether the Act could be extended to explicitly cover facial images.
Dr. Boba.
I'm not a legal expert, so I would like to refrain from... I don't think I have anything to add to Dr. Pursehouse and Dr. Lawless. I'm aware that Scottish Police have their own way of archiving facial data. So I believe that the custody images are not retained into the National Police database unless someone has been charged, or if the person has not been convicted within 6 months. So I guess the Police Scotland is ahead of English colleagues, so to speak, in this respect. But I think...
and there may be aspects that we touch on. Can I ask the witnesses, just in very broad brush terms, about the situation with the Welsh case, and whether the principles of necessity and proportionality, the police force there presumably felt it met these criteria. Do you have a view in that? And would you envisage challenges in Scotland where this technology is to be put in place?
Do you want to go first?
Again, trying to sort of keep this in broadest terms. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who's not a legal expert as such, but as someone who takes a professional interest in these kinds of judgments. I feel it's probably best left for other colleagues to maybe speak more about the legal intricacies of this kind of case. But it does make me think that we need to be kind of attuned to perhaps further challenges. I mean, I was wondering, reading that judgment, what if this had been another case where the individual, say, was someone who had been directly impacted by facial recognition, say they found out they had been on a watch list, or they'd suffered perhaps adverse consequences as a result of a false positive identification. So that leads me to sort of wonder, that there could be possible future challenges. Again, perhaps for me, it depends on the individual circumstances and how they engage with facial recognition technology, which could be very different in all sorts of ways, really.
Yeah, I would echo the view that Dr. Lawless has expressed, that this was quite a limited challenge in that case, referring to quite a specific context, particularly on the necessity of the measures. I think when we look at necessity and proportionality, these are very broad questions. Human rights law really is offering a process for structuring the analysis of where the balance should be struck between the benefits or potential benefits, or harms and potential harms of using this technology. And it raises sort of complex questions, sometimes requiring political judgment. But I think it's important to remember that it is for those who are interfering with the right, or purporting to do that, to justify the use of the technology as necessary and proportionate. And what human rights law sets out is that the use of the technology has to have some significant benefit that couldn't be achieved through less intrusive means, and that the cost benefits are worth it, basically. And I think there are serious question marks, particularly with the trials of live facial recognition technology here. There are questions over exactly how accurate the technology is, whether or not it has the potential to discriminate against certain communities, the broader social consequences it has, not just for individuals who are scanned, but the way it changes how we relate to publicly accessible spaces, particularly in the context of, say, a protest or attending a football match, and ultimately could damage the legitimacy of the police if this is seen to be an oppressive technology that's been rolled out in ways that the public don't necessarily understand or trust.
So I would like to touch a little bit more about the quality of the technology and how this might impact further challenges. So
to come on to these questions, if I could just hold you there and we'll welcome your comments. Can I ask, I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the constabularies who have deployed this equipment, but is it your understanding that they will have made any sort of assessment, a risk assessment, human rights assessment, community impact assessment, call it what you will, in which they've weighed up this constant tension between individual liberties and their perception that deploying this equipment is a community safety? Is that been made apparent in public at all?
I mean, my understanding is that they have had to conduct certain assessments over, I think, data privacy impact assessment, a quality impact assessment. So there has been some forethought. I got the impression that perhaps there was a little concern about how thorough the forces had been. Well, I'm talking more specifically about South Wales's police. I can't really comment too much about the Metropolitan Police, but it certainly seems there was at least, you know, effort to try and meet, you know, these kinds of stipulated criteria. I don't know if colleagues can offer any more detail on that.
So with regards to Metropolitan Police, I'm not sure about the assessment procedures, but my understanding is that the Metropolitan Police have engaged with the public during the trials, and that the public were informed in, that the trials were being conducted. There were leaflets, police were handing out leaflets and speaking to the public about the use of facial recognition live.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a number of questions following up on some of the points you've made there. I'll pass to Liam now. Thank you.
Just following up on that, in relation to the use of live facial recognition technology, Police Scotland have made clear that they haven't trialled it to date, but it's equally clear from their 10-year strategy that they're anticipating deployment over the course of that period. I think it's fair to say that they have some anxieties around the functionality, but they've also, I think, accepted that some of the legalities of it could do with for greater clarification. I mean, what would be your view on the importance of getting that legal framework right from the outset, and how would you anticipate Police Scotland best going about obtaining that legal clarity?
Well, there's a very nice quote that one of the other written submissions used. It was from Professor Paul Wiles, the UK Biometrics Commissioner. And he said, bolting on governance rules after technical development is much costlier than developing technical solutions within known rules. And that's a statement that I very much agree with. I think it's clear to have clear guidelines and understandings before I think this technology is deployed. For me, I've read the Policing 2026 document, so I understand there is a kind of vision about this. But for me, really, I would rather strongly feel that we do go down the route of introducing a Scottish Biometrics Commissioner first, having that role in place, having a code of practice at least, you know, formulated. Of course, these can be reviewed, and to have the kinds of perhaps the advisory systems in place before facial recognition is considered and before it's trialled. As I say, I think it's important to have the framework before the technology is used. So there is an understanding on the part of the police of the rules in which they can manoeuvre, really.
Do you see it as, given the level of public debate there already is around live facial recognition technology, that would need to be a priority area for the incoming Biometrics Commissioner?
I think so, yeah. I think there does need to be an appropriately rigorous public engagement process. I mean, I can to talk a little bit more about that. We do know that there are some surveys out there from the Ada Lovelace Institute and by the London Policing Ethics Panel. So we do have some data on public attitudes. It is only limited, of course, with any poll. We should be careful not to take one poll as the last word. But if we have a number of pieces of public research, of surveys, then maybe we can start to discern a trend. The Cardiff University study did also have some data on public attitudes. What I see so far is a sense in which the public's view seems to be positive but very mixed. So there is some support for facial recognition, but that varies depending on what it might intended to be used for. So there's more support, it seems, amongst the limited surveys we have, for using facial recognition in connection with serious crimes, but less support for more minor crimes. I thought it was interesting with the London Policing Ethics Panel reports. It's quite notable that whereas overall there was majority public support, there was a quite significant opposition among the younger age group as well. So that these kind of factors need to be taken into account. So I think that the priority really is a public engagement exercise. Again, that could involve similar kinds of surveys. I do wonder actually if this is a question perhaps for a citizens' jury kind of framework as well. It's interesting sort of reading some of the reflections about citizens' juries. I think one of the participants talks about how the boundary between experts and citizens is actually quite blurred than we might think. Members of the public can bring their own experiences to bear on these kinds of questions in quite informed ways. But I think I mean, there's always this question of what constitutes public approval, and that is a difficult question. But I think providing, but I think that the least that could be done is to utilise all possible public engagement methods, really.
Yeah.
Yes, I think Margaret wanted to come in at this point. Maybe it'd be something that...
Yes, it was a related question, really, as well as public engagement. If we're actually moving to public consent, then do you think this technology should have community and human rights assessments attached to it, so there really is a proper legal base, I suppose, in a way, consent there?
Absolutely. I think... just touching on public opinion and human rights and the relationship between them, I think public opinion and public support for the use of technology is important. If it's not there, then that's a strong barrier against using it. But it's not the end of the matter. Human rights, I think it's worth remembering, are there to protect vulnerable minorities. And what the surveys are showing, as Christopher alluded to, is that those demographics that tend to be subject to policing more frequently are less supportive of the use of technology. And any breakdown of public support should acknowledge that. And in terms of coming back to what Scotland should do in approaching whether or not to use this technology, I think it's absolutely right that there's a putting the horse before the cart issue here. It's important to have an idea of the rules that should be in place to research the impacts of this technology, both on individuals and on society as a whole, and have a broad debate about its proper limits before using the technology. What we saw in England and Wales in the trials of this technology were inconsistent practices between forces and private organisations that decided to trial the technology. So some organisations that used the technology would decide that it's appropriate to gather images from multiple different sources. Others restricted themselves to the use of custody images. Some decided to pursue non-criminal infractions, antisocial behaviour. Others focused on strict criminality. And this inconsistency and some of the problematic practices might have been avoided if we'd have had a broader debate and put some rules in place before outrolling its use, deciding whether it's something that should be a tool that's reserved for the most serious crimes or something that is used more broadly.
And just to be clear then, would that be a sort of carte blanche on deployment in open spaces as wide as that? Or does it need to be refined in any way? If it's to be a prerequisite before deployment, just how precise do we have to be?
Well, what myself and my colleagues who developed our written submission recommended was a moratorium on the use of the technology, and I think that's particularly important in public spaces. And what that essentially means is to pause the use of this technology or block it until the case is made that there's clear uses for it, that the dangers of demographic bias have been properly mitigated, and that this can be closely regulated so its use truly is proportionate.
If I could just very quickly come in there. Sorry, Anne, did you want to speak first?
I just wanted to quickly add to this that I think it's incredibly important that also special cases are very carefully thought of. How would police or how would the law enforcement agencies deal with, for example, data taken from children or scanning underaged or any situations in which the search is not focused exactly how yourself and the colleagues talked about public spaces where the search isn't focused and someone might pop up. How is that dealt with? And also, how would we regulate the competency of people who sit at the other end of the software, who operate facial recognition technology? Because what we know, for example, is that at the end of the day, it's the human that makes a decision, who, for example, gets candidate list of potential matches from the technology, and how do we also ensure that those people, we know that human face recognition is extremely fallible, so just because someone is presented with an image from software and a potential candidate list from the police database, then they have to make a decision about how to proceed. And what is incredibly important is to make sure that those people's kind of their natural face recognition ability allows them to make those decisions to proceed correctly, so to speak.
For me, when we're talking about proportionality, it seems to me that it's really the important issue is the purposes, the specific purposes which facial recognition might be used for. And I think if those purposes can be expressed as clearly as they possibly can, that is really the key issue in determining proportionality, I think.
Thank you.
You've been very clear about the need to get the framework in place before rollout takes place, and I think the arguments for that seem to be very reasonable. We've done a sort of compare and contrast between what's happening south of the border, where we are in Scotland. But are there any jurisdictions where they're slightly ahead of the game in terms of that broader framework? I suppose the more detailed and granular you try to make it, the more risk there is that in the development technology and the way that it's used can't be anticipated and you run up against problems. But I mean, are there any parts of the world that we should be looking to for some clues as to what the framework here in Scotland might look like going forward?
I don't know of a particular jurisdiction that's that far ahead with this that has actually developed a framework and then started to use it. What the picture internationally, to my mind, is that some jurisdictions have a free rein on facial recognition surveillance and are determined to outroll it as far and as wide as possible, and I'm sure that's not a model that Scotland would want to follow. Others already have some broader regulations and are outrolling the technology and relying on those broader frameworks to govern its use, and England and Wales might be a model for that. And then others are at the point of considering the appropriate parameters of facial recognition surveillance and the extent to which there's a democratic mandate for its use before outrolling it. And I'd say New Zealand is a good example. I'm part of a funded project looking at the regulations in New Zealand, and they're basically using it in quite a limited way at the moment, similar to Scotland, and are thinking about what needs to be in place before its use.
If you had any further information on the New Zealand experience, that would be welcome. Thank you very much indeed, Doctor.
Follow up with that.
Thank you. Rona, you're next.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, panel. Yes, I'd like to ask you about the accuracy and reliability of the technology. It's been touched on a wee bit so far. So studies have shown that the technology used in live facial recognition can be subject to issues like racial and gender bias. And a lot of false positives are created when they're matching it up with watch lists, etc. Can you maybe expand a bit on that issue and suggest any way that that could be rectified? Because that's clearly a very serious issue if it's a mismatch.
So I'd be happy to take that question. The ethnic and gender bias, it's not an issue inherent to the technology. It purely relies on the training sets that are used to train the algorithms. So in one of the submissions, I read that most of the algorithms, the training set is basically what the algorithm gets trained on, and then the test set is what it's tested on. So if the training set predominantly includes faces from Caucasian men, then the algorithm will be biased towards higher accuracy for these types of faces. But I guess part of the regulation and the quality assurance should be looking at the population that the facial recognition will be used in, and ensuring that the training sets are reflective of these populations to avoid those bias. But those can be rectified. But what I was actually looking at, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US is a public body that actually has a continuous vendor test where companies are submitting their algorithms for tests, and this can be as frequent as every 4 months. So this gives us an idea in how fast the field and the technology develops. And I was looking at the most recent test, and actually the technology or the company that provided technology for the Metropolitan and the Welsh Police is not in the top 20 performing algorithms. So I suppose there are ways in assessing the quality and that we can look at those tests, but I feel like this should be really under scrutiny, how to invest the public money. Because, as I said, I'm not really sure whether NEC, who was the company, and that's, I believe that's public information. I have not seen NEC on those performing well on those tests in the last few releases of this report.
Yeah, I mean, the concern I have, looking at the experience of facial recognition so far in England and Wales, is that the police are obviously reliant on commercial technology. These seem to me to be off-the-shelf products. And there's questions that have arisen as to just how fit for purpose these algorithms are. Certainly in the South Wales case, it seems there was a considerable learning curve that the police had to go through to learn the kind of vagaries of this technology in terms of, you know, knowing how to set thresholds for determining matches, and there was a lot of learning and variation in terms of how to use the technology in that kind of way. I noticed there was a concern, particularly though, that they found that one of the algorithms they were using had problems in terms of inaccurate categorizations of people, for example, on gender identification. And it was something that the operators just simply had to live with. They didn't seem to have much chance to really kind of, you know, shape the kind of technology they wanted to use. And this is, I think, a general concern, actually. And I think it leads me to think in general terms, not just about facial recognition, that the police do need to be quite wary, I think, about the claims that some of these technology providers make, really, and to be really quite... And I think we do need perhaps quite an open conversation between these suppliers and their users, really.
Thank you. As a non-technical person, I didn't even know algorithms were involved. I do know that means they're computer-generated. So did that not raise quite a few questions about, you know, is it the same software used throughout, or do individual forces and areas get to choose, you know, who chooses what's going to be used, and who actually evaluates it to see whether it's fit for purpose?
I mean, my with South Wales is that they gained Home Office funding, I believe, to invest in facial recognition technology, and I believe that they put out they put it out to tender to companies to bid for these services. I think that's correct, isn't it? And it just so happens that I think NEC were successful. Really, that's how I understand the process to have been in that case. Really.
So would you envisage in Scotland it would be a case of it would be standardised? You know, it would be the one piece of software that was used and evaluated in that sense. I mean, given that we're aware that there are problems, surely that it needs to be as accurate as it can be.
It seems to me really that the police forces are inevitably going to have to rely on commercial providers for this kind of technology. I think in Scotland there is a question there about, again, if the Scottish Biometric Commissioner was to be instituted, what kind of conversations would need to be had between potential providers and their customers, really. And that can involve some quite awkward questions about how much commercial providers are willing to disclose. But I think there needs to be some kind of way of kind of agreeing on some basic standards, really, and expectations.
That's really what I was getting at. There's got to be surely, you know, some sort of benchmark that they have to reach. And if I could just, you mentioned an earlier question, Dr. Bobak, about the relationship, the human element to it, you know, and matching, etc. I mean, are you confident that that's of a high enough standard? Because obviously that's crucial, you know, for someone to be able to be...
Performance.
Yeah.
So what we know is that human face recognition and matching ability for unfamiliar faces, so for faces that we don't know personally as our colleagues, family and friends, is on a continuum. So some people are very bad at recognizing faces, some people, most of us are somewhere in the middle, and some people are at the top end of this distribution, if you imagine. And what we would ideally want to make sure is that people who operate this type of software are at this top end of the distribution, because otherwise it can lead to all sorts of problems. Can I just add to the technology question? So I believe both South Wales and the London Metropolitan Police use the same software from NEC, which is a Japanese company. I think it's called NeoWatch. And although I am not aware of the exact ins and outs of how the software was acquired, I have been once at the Home Office Expo where companies advertise to Home Office and to police and offer their services, and NEC certainly was there. Now what I think would be extremely useful in quality assurance and making sure that the top algorithms are used is inviting academic independent computer scientists to the table who can almost translate between the police force or the law enforcement agency that would like to acquire such software and private sector companies. But its development of algorithms is not only restricted to the private sector. There is, for example, research councils fund development of facial recognition software, and there is on a computer science grant that is shared between Stirling Imperial College and Surrey University. So there is public interest and there is public stake in developing top performing algorithms. So we're not only but yeah, I think my main point is that a computer scientist at the table who takes part in legislation and quality assurance would be extremely useful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Liam. Following
Up,
James.
There's a few views, concerns have been expressed around Police Scotland's use of the UK Police National Database for storing images. Some concerns around whether or not this then is adhering to rules around retention periods, etc., particularly for those who are not and subsequently convicted of a crime. I mean, are those concerns that you would share, and what would you see as the remedy for addressing those concerns?
I think those are very real concerns. So, to give you a little bit of the history in brief, there was a High Court case about the retention of custody images of people who've been arrested but not ultimately convicted of an offence. And the blanket policy of the UK government at that time was deemed to be inadequate. It was didn't meet Article 8. It was disproportionate to retain these images as widely as they have. Since then, the Home Office implemented a policy of, well, if your image has been retained and you're one of these arrestees who hasn't been convicted, you can apply to have it taken off the database. People don't really know about this. It hasn't been well publicised, and the take-up of that was very low. So you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these images that have been retained and continue to be retained years after people have been convicted, been disposed of without a conviction. And these are all on the Police National Database. So I think it's important that Police Scotland is aware of that, and that there are things in place to manage whether or not Police Scotland will have access to or potentially use those images that have been stored latently long after someone has been involved in a criminal process and not convicted in a facial recognition system. I think it's one thing, and it is a privacy intrusion, to retain this image, a custody image of someone and a profile long after they've been disposed of, an innocent person. It's another thing to then add privacy intrusions to that by further processing that image using a facial recognition system, or potentially conscripting that person into a virtual police lineup. So yeah, it's something to be managed. I don't quite know how you do that technically.
I would say it may be oversimplifying it, but in terms of the closure of a case where somebody has not been convicted, Police Scotland will be better placed than anybody to know what images have been sent for storage, and therefore are best placed then to request their deletion. Is there a complexity to that process that as a layperson I'm not privy to, or would that process itself, to your mind, be fairly straightforward?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Well, in terms of the closure of a case where the court proceedings have taken place and somebody's been found not guilty, or whether they've decided not to proceed at all, Police Scotland will be in a position to know what images have been sent to the national database for storage, and therefore you would assume are best placed to request their deletion as part of the wrapping up of matters relating to that case. I mean, is there a complexity to that that's not immediately obvious, or would you see it as fairly straightforward?
No, I'd say that's fairly straightforward, and I think the Scottish approach of having time-limited retention and not retaining these images when people have received a non-conviction disposal is important. I believe that it came up in Big Brother Watch's submission with Open Rights Group that images that have been uploaded historically of non-convicted persons might continue to be retained on Scottish databases. I don't know if that's something that the committee might look into. But also, if Scottish Police are using facial recognition software on the Police National Database, which contains non-convicted images of many people across England, Wales and Scotland, there's the potential for intrusion that might be something for the Biometrics Commissioner to look at how that's managed.
The concern, I was thinking about this question before, and the concern that I had, I was imagining a scenario where perhaps Police Scotland were investigating quite serious crime in Scotland, and perhaps they might have found a match from the PND from someone from England and Wales, or whose image had been put up, who, again, they were innocent and not convicted or charged. And yet, what would happen perhaps legally if that person was, prosecuted in Scotland, and whether there might be some grounds for appeal, really. I was trying to sort of think around that scenario, and whether, again, it's another argument for extending the Protection of Freedom Acts in England and Wales to facial data. And perhaps having a similar kind of retention regime that we have with DNA. But obviously that depends very much on England and Wales to sort of make those kinds of changes. And what does Police Scotland could do in terms of their guidelines for comparing images in the PND. And the best that I could come up with for now was that perhaps Police Scotland could act as if the Protections of Freedom Act did apply to facial images in those kinds of scenarios, if that was some way of at least trying to maintain a kind of consistency, at least for now, really.
There is a risk that even if the reliability of the match is 100% of whatever is seen as the threshold, the fact that an image had been retained inappropriately would render that inadmissible and could be a technicality on which somebody
could be challenged, perhaps, or appealed on.
Right.
It could be a contentious point. I don't know if it would. I don't know enough about the admissibility rules in Scotland to give a firm view on that. In England and Wales, they would admit that as evidence. But it's a general privacy risk that I think may not be easy to solve, or may not be within the remit of Scottish lawmakers to resolve, because England and Wales is retaining these images. I appreciate that, but it's something perhaps to be mindful of when setting policies on this.
So I have 2 points to add to this. So first one, I believe that the retention of images in the PND has been challenged historically in courts, and it has been deemed unlawful to keep images of people who have further been proclaimed as innocent. But there are technical issues with deletion of those images, but this problem might partially solve itself once the technical issue will be resolved and those unlawful images will be deleted. When it comes to the admissibility of the evidence, I have actually spoken to the Metropolitan Police about this last week, and my understanding is that there are two types of image evidence or intelligence that one might collect. So if we have a potential match, but there is no one at the human end to verify it who personally knows the person. So say a police constable who have previously arrested someone and they know this person. This is not evidence as such in court. It can only be treated as evidence. It can only, be treated as intelligence. However, if there is someone who knows this person, so for instance, a police constable who would identify them personally because they've arrested them 3 times in England, then that might be deemed as admissible evidence, and it's I think it's called Code Pasty compliant.
I wonder if I could just probe a little bit about, whether it would be admissible in court. And we certainly heard some evidence from the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service that if there wasn't necessarily a legal basis, that wouldn't necessarily make it inadmissible, and that the prosecutors would look at the fairness, and then the court itself would look at the facts and circumstances of each case. Is that a general kind of way that you see this operating? Is it sufficient? Should more be done? Or is that quite adequate checks and balances?
The way it operates similarly in English courts, there's a balance between the probative value of the evidence and its prejudicial effect. So basically balancing, did the ends justify the means, and should we admit it anyway? It sounds like what you're describing is a similar rule in Scotland. It's a difficult one it's quite a complicated issue with lots of arguments on either side that might take you quite far away from the focus of this inquiry. I think
it's a subjective sort of
there is some subjectivity to it, and there's different schools of thought whether people should ever be able to admit improperly obtained evidence, whether we should be able to admit it all, or probably the view I would subscribe to is somewhere in the middle. You don't want to maybe jeopardise or have collapse really serious prosecutions with really strong, credible and reliable evidence because of maybe something that's a very minor technical procedural oversight. I think that it's right, there's some balance, and where you strike that is a very difficult question with, as you say, some element of subjectivity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. James.
Thank you, Convener. I want to explore the issue of where live facial recognition technology is used at kind of public events. So, for example, if it was used at a political rally or a march or a football match, for example, is there a danger that it could make those present feel that their right to freedom of expression has been compromised or undermined?
I think so, yes. Would be the short answer, but I'll elaborate a little bit. We've seen where this technology has been rolled out at football matches, football fans and football fan association groups have been really quite resistant to it, and there was an example in South Wales, the Cardiff versus Swansea match a couple of months ago, where we saw these in-stadium protests take place. I believe when it was proposed to use it in live facial recognition in Scotland at football matches, fan groups objected to that. So it could have this chilling effect. It could harm the relationship between, say, the police and a group like football fans, where there might be some historical tensions between those groups. And if surveillance is seen as unjustified or oppressive, then it may not have the desired effect of building trust or confidence between groups. I think some of that carries over to protest movements as well, in particular. There's a growing body of empirical research that suggests that when overt surveillance is used at marches and on protest groups, legitimate protest and non-violent protest groups, it can harm and chill the activities of these groups. So basically, when the surveillance camera van arrives, it can damage the perceived legitimacy of that group in the eyes of the public. It can make them struggle to generate resources and public support, which is obviously something that is a risk. It might be proportionate in some circumstances. I don't want to express a strong view on if it could ever be proportionate, but it's something that needs to be mitigated and managed, certainly.
I mean, I think just to follow on from the issue around political demonstrations, I think one of the problems with this is that it's probably quite difficult to really establish, in terms of measuring the chilling effect, it's quite difficult because it could well be very difficult to evaluate how many people might have chosen to stay away because of the presence of cameras, really, which is, I think, one of the issues that I think really kind of makes this very difficult. But I'd largely agree that I think I share the concerns in general about about how people might respond and feel about the presence of facial recognition technology. There is a famous strand in sociology which argues that if we know that we are being under surveillance, we behave in certain ways, we manage our behaviour in the knowledge that we're under surveillance, and I think that's something to consider, really. I think just further to this about using face recognition at these kinds of events. So again, I think it goes back to me about this point about being open and as clear and as specific about what policing outcomes are intended from the use of facial recognition. And that might be one possible mitigating factor if the police, again, are as open and as precise as possible about what they intend to use facial recognition for and be very specific about that. That might be one way of beginning to facilitate a bit of trust. But I think it's still a very complex issue, I think.
If I may add to this, it also depends how the facial recognition, as Christopher said, is deployed. So whether the search or the face recognition is deployed indiscriminately in that it surveys all the faces available, or perhaps there is more targeted search because there is a concert and there are 10 well-known pickpocketers who are being looked for. And in this case, the public perception and the public trust might be different as to when someone would surveil, for example, a political march indiscriminately. But I guess a lot comes down to transparency in how this software is being used and public information campaign, in that the public are aware in how exactly it is deployed and used.
Currently, the Scottish Parliament's considering a bill to establish a Scottish Biometrics Commissioner. Do you think the issue of live facial recognition technology and linked to public confidence is something that the Commissioner should have as a high priority?
Yes. if I could make just one comparison between the situation in England and Wales on this matter. So the oversight framework, you have the Information Commissioner, who is responsible for giving opinions and has published an opinion on live facial recognition recently, which I'd recommend looking at, assessing the operation of that, and the Commissioner also has enforcement powers. The Biometrics Commissioner doesn't have a remit over facial recognition technology. They focus solely on DNA and fingerprint data. And I think bringing that into the remit of the Biometrics Commissioner would be a good thing to do. I don't suggest taking it away from the Information Commissioner. I think the Information Commissioner has a really important role looking at the data protection implications of the use of this technology. But the advantage of extending the Biometrics Commissioner's remit to include this is that facial recognition engages more than just data protection concerns. Data protection concerns are very serious, but there are broader human rights issues here to do with bias, to do with discrimination, and also to do with the nature of our interactions with our public spaces and whether this is a social good in the round. And I think a Biometrics Commissioner can perhaps take a broader view of the impact and consequences of the technology.
I think with regard to the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill, it seems to me that perhaps there are some aspects of facial recognition in terms of its regulation that actually possibly could potentially apply to a whole host of biometrics. So I know it's been suggested, for example, with facial recognition, we should be transparent and publish data on the performance of something like facial recognition. That to me is something that could possibly apply to other forms of biometric data. Certainly being transparent on the procedures for establishing a match between an individual and a reference database, I think is another one. You know, we have watch lists for facial recognition. I mean, any biometric or most biometrics rely on comparing an individual piece of data with a collection of data. And I think that's a principle that perhaps needs to be considered, the reasons for collecting certain pieces of biometric data for the purposes of comparing them. And yeah, in terms of perhaps advance warning or informing the public that certain biometric techniques such as facial recognition are to be used in certain situations. Again, I think we could perhaps learn a lot from thinking about facial recognition that could be applied, again, to other biometrics in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thank you. Fulton.
Good afternoon, panel. Given that many of the technological developments will be driven by private companies, is there any concern that you have about the possible blurring of boundaries between private companies and public bodies like the police?
Yes, and I read with interest some of the work this committee is doing on the Biometrics Commissioner's Bill. It looks like you're establishing this commissioner to look at biometric technologies as they are used for a policing purpose. And I think it's important to take that and interpret it broadly, because increasingly private companies and even citizens are using technologies that have biometric capabilities for what is ostensibly policing, crime prevention, detection, public safety, or their own safety. And we saw an example of this in England and Wales with how the technology, live facial recognition, was used at King's Cross, the privately owned site at King's Cross, which was publicly accessible. So you've got a blurring of private and publicly accessible space, and you've got a blurring of private and public bodies using biometric surveillance technology. And I think it's important not to take too narrow an interpretation of terms like policing purpose, so you can express a view and regulate those types of activities.
Just both broadly agree with that. And do you think then that there should any legal framework should explicitly refer to those who have responsibility for capturing, storing and deleting images on live facial recognition?
public and private domain, or just in the public domain?
Public, I would.
Yeah, I mean, in my view is that should certainly be regulated. It seems to me like Police Scotland already has a very advanced approach to this and a very sensible approach to storing and deletion of images, but any such issues should be regulated.
Yeah, I think it's important that the Commissioner's role can cover both, and the interplay between them, and issue guidance as appropriate on that in the Code of Practice.
And what about the sort of more general question of, you know, if private companies are, because I think you've answered around about the use of the technology between the private and public sector, and I appreciate those answers, but what about where there may be financial interests of private companies who are developing and selling technology? Do you see any sort of blurring of boundaries there in that respect?
Yeah, so my view and the mitigating of this would be to employ independent academic experts in computer science to assess any potential software and to translate and to make sure that the public money is used in an appropriate way. Because I think in expos and when if a call would be made to purchase such software, of course the leading companies would be private, and then one can only go by what they provide as information. So someone who independently can verify any claims that they make would be extremely useful for law enforcement agencies.
I agree, and again, I just refer back to my perhaps previous comments about the concerns about you know, using technology off the shelf. I think with regard to private use of biometrics as well, again, this is perhaps an area of concern that needs to be considered in relation to the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill and its scope as well, really.
Thanks.
Can I ask the panel, and this is perhaps unfair, and I'll understand if you're not in a position to comment, but the committee did some work on an issue called cyber kiosks that you may be familiar with, and it seems that there's a number of recurring themes there about the capability of the equipment, issues like collateral intrusion, and Police Scotland responded to a report that the committee produced and responded very positively and has engaged with various groups, a stakeholder group and an implementation group. Is the sort of approach you think that should be adopted in relation to an issue like this?
So could you repeat the question?
Do you think the approach that Police Scotland has taken, not rolling out the cyber kiosk equipment, prior to establishing a clear legal basis and prior to dealing with an implementation group and a stakeholder group, which include many of the organisations who have responded to our request for information, do you think that's a sound approach that should be taken in relation to this?
I think so. I mean, I note now that Police Scotland has halted rollout of the cyber kiosks. I did read the report on cyber kiosks. I was, I mean, if memory serves, I was somewhat concerned about the level of communication with the police authorities in terms of communicating this rollout. It seemed to me that you know, some of the ethical concerns about cyber kiosks only arose perhaps, you know, after the initial move. So I'm somewhat concerned about the level of communication. But it does seem, I'm reading the report, that perhaps that has been a bit of a learning process for all, really. And I was quite I was quite interested and quite heartened to read some of the recommendations that came out of that report in terms of emphasising a sense of caution and a need to communicate among, you know, stakeholders before any of this technology is rolled out, and to think carefully about some of the ethical impacts. So perhaps maybe the cyber kiosk has been, as I say, something of an experience, a bit of a learning opportunity. Maybe it's an opportunity to perhaps put a few things right as well in terms of communication. But I think at least the positive that's come out of it for me again is that, you know, there is a need again for communication, but also again to be, you know, to exercise a certain caution and to think these kinds of issues through before rollouts, really.
I think there's definitely a recurring theme with the cyber kiosks and with lots of these technologies. Historically, it seems like history repeats itself. And I don't want to criticise the police. I don't think there's any bad faith here, but part of the police function is to prevent and detect crime as best they see fit, and to use technologies as they become available and experiment with them in order to do that. And they face pressures of budgets and the pressures that come with failing to exercise that function or when mistakes are made. And I think a lot of police approach this with good intentions and want to have clear guidance and want to use the law within its, the technology within its appropriate legal limits. And I think it's the committee's job and our job to set those standards and lead the way on thinking ahead to what technologies might be coming down the pipeline or are starting to emerge, and take a proactive role in deciding what the appropriate democratic limits are and what the use of this technology might look like in a human rights compliant way. There's an element of a pattern of the police sort of using it and trying to sort of guess what the limits are, and then the back and forth of legal challenges and regulation seems to play catch up in this area. So I think it's really welcome that the committee is doing the work it is.
Yeah, I think I would agree with this. I guess it's a difficult position because the technology develops very fast, and some of it, of course, may or may not be very useful for the police to maximize their stretched resources. But I think it's very important that we engage in this dialogue, and this committee is very good first step, I think. But a legal framework certainly is, in my opinion, is paramount to ahead of enrollment of any live facial recognition software, and clear guidance.
Okay, that concludes our meeting. Can I thank the witnesses very much for the written and the oral testimony, which was extremely helpful. We're now going to move into private session, so I'll suspend briefly to allow the public gallery to clear. Thank you.